One of the things that you could always say about investors is everybody wants to be early, but nobody wants to be first. But there's been challenges not only with the markets, but also challenges between the government and the Port Authority. The way I see it is the Port Authority is a franchisee of the government of the Bahamas, and they should have a franchise or franchisee relationship.
I agree with you. I think the key to really unlocking the true potential of Grand Bahama is figuring out how the Port Authority can reestablish a working relationship with the government, where the government doesn't see it as a foreign enclave in their country, but rather sees it as an extension of Bahamian sovereignty and Bahamian will, while at the same time ensuring that there is a competitive enough business environment to attract investment, to create jobs, to really build a thriving city. Welcome to the Charter Cities podcast. Today I'm joined by Dillon Knowles, who is the president of the Grand Bahama Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to the podcast, Dillon.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me.
So I guess to start, let's give maybe a general overview of Grand Bahama, of Freeport, of the history, Hawksbill Creek Agreement, and a very kind of high-level overview.
So Grand Bahama is the northernmost island in the archipelago of the Bahama Islands, and it actually runs east-west, which is very strange because most of the islands in the country run north-south, but Grand Bahama does run east-west. It's 110 miles long by 7 miles wide at its widest point, and it currently houses somewhere around 40 to 50,000 people, depending upon who is counting. It used to be a sleepy fishing village back in the day until a guy named Wallace Groves came along. He was a American financier who had actually acquired a company called the Abaco Lumber Company, and their business was felling pine trees in Abaco Island, on Abaco Island, to ship to the UK as pit props in the mining industry. And so after cutting down all of the pine trees on Abaco, he then migrated his way over to Grand Bahama Island, which is just to the immediate west. It's really all part of one coral reef, really, but with some water in between. And so it had similar terrain and topology. And he got a lease of a significant amount of land from the Bahamas government in order to fell the pine trees on Grand Bahama. And that he did. And the story is that as he was standing at what is called Hawksbill Creek, one day he saw ships passing by on the horizon and thought that Hawksbill Creek would be a great place to have a deep water harbor to which industry could develop and support the shipping industry on the east coast of the Americas. And so he approached the government of the Bahamas with a cockamamie plan to develop a city, a privately owned, privately developed city. And the government was very receptive at the time to his proposal, and went as far as to create an act of parliament which granted Groves and his company, the Grand Bahama Port Authority Limited, which he formed as a special purpose vehicle specifically for this purpose, granted them the right to acquire crown land from the government and buy land from private owners to develop the city. There are many aspects of that act which are very significant, were innovative at the time. It essentially turned what we now call Freeport, Lucaya, into a free trade zone, the first modern free trade zone in the world. And it provided for the administration of that city by this private company that Groves owned. And so from there, we developed the infrastructure for a city that is capable of housing 300,000 people, along with all the necessary modern infrastructure that you would expect in a city built in the last 70 years. If we fast forward, the island went through a lot of changes This all happened, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement was signed in 1955 and gave Groves and his company a 99-year, if you wish, free trade act, under which, as I said, he was able to govern the development of the city, and he was both regulator and developer. Going forward, in 1967, during the height of the civil rights movement in North America, there was an election held here in the Bahamas, and it was the first majority rule election in the history of the country. By majority rule, we mean one person, one vote. Prior to that, the vote was based on land holdings, and so there was a very minority-run country because the minority held the land and therefore had the majority of the votes. And so in 67, there was a change in government from a essentially Caucasian government to a essentially African background government in 67. And that brought in a new era of national identity and what was then termed Bahamianization. That meaning, as with most countries, that the economy needed to be based on the availability of the natives of that country, the indigenous citizens of the country, and not necessarily solely based on foreign investment. And so the then new Prime Minister, Lyndon Pinland, then took it upon himself to resolve what he thought to be a country within a country in Freeport, where Groves and his company essentially ran things as if they were a quasi-local government entity. And he gave what was then called the infamous bend or break speech. And in that speech, he essentially told the Port Authority and their investors that they either had to change the social fabric of Freeport and allow the natives to engage in not only the economy of Freeport, but also the social aspects, housing and what have you of Freeport, all be broken. That set off an avalanche of investors leaving the island because they all thought that the government's next step was to nationalize their assets. Obviously, that never happened that way, but the pole was already stuck in the ground, the flag was already stuck in the ground, and people react the way they react. No matter what your intentions were, people do what they respond in the way that seems comfortable to themselves. And that kind of caused the exodus of a lot of investors who were at that time engaged in developing real estate on Grand Bahama within the Freeport-Lucaya area. Groves himself got cold feet and decided that he needed to protect his assets, and he took his private company public with the consent of the new government, and it became an entity of a Panamanian company called Intercontinental Diversified, and it was traded on New York Stock Exchange. At that point, he kind of separated out the development side of his business from the regulatory function in his business, and all of the development assets were transferred over to a sister company called the Grand Bahama Development Company, and the Grand Bahama Port Authority essentially just played the role of quasi-local government regulator, the signatory to the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, the one who could license investors and businesses, whether they be local or international, to do business in Freeport-Lucaya. Just for context sake, Freeport-Lucaya is 230 square miles. It came about in two tranches of land from the government. The first tranche was a 50,000 acre tranche, which was given to what we now call and created what we now call Freeport. and was given on the basis that the Port Authority would not only administer to it, but also would develop a deep water harbor of certain dimensions and would cause the development of the infrastructure to entice investment by others to utilize the natural resources of Grand Bahama for the betterment of Grand Bahama and by extension the entire Commonwealth of the Bahamas. A couple of years later, Groves had decided that industrial development was not happening as quickly as he would have liked, and the economic environment in the US was not as strong as he had thought it would have been. And so he went back to the government and asked for an additional 110,000 acres of land for the purposes of creating a touristic and residential resort development, which we now call Lucayo. So when you add the two together, you come up with 160,000 acres or 230 square miles sitting in the middle of Grand Bahama Island, with the West Grand Bahama district, which is still managed by the government, and the East Grand Bahama district also continued to be managed by the central government of the Bahamas. Groves did a wonderful job of creating the infrastructure for Freeport Lucaya. The amount of roadways, electrical systems, water systems, cable, television, telecommunication systems was phenomenal at that time and still is today. And he subdivided, master planned and subdivided that 160,000 acres of land into very clearly delineated parcels with zoning all covered by restrictive covenants, and managed a very effective regulatory regime to control the development of the city of Freeport Lucaya. We still see the benefits of that today. And as everything in Freeport Lucaya was privately owned, roads, utility companies, municipal services, everything is paid for as in by the consumer. It is not funded by the government of the Bahamas in any way, shape, or form. So taxpayer funds do not currently or have never provided the services that a city would come to depend on. They are all provided by private entities, some of which still are owned by the Port Authority Group, and some of which have been spun out to individual investors, like Amera Corporation from Canada owns the power company. Essentially, Hutchison Whampoa and Hutchison Group controls the harbor, and Port Authority does still own the water company. The telecommunications has now been the monopoly on that has been broken, and we have two cable companies, two telephone companies. So there's been lots of development over the last 70 years of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement on Grand Bahama, but there's also been a lot that is detracted from the development of Grand Bahama, and particularly Freeport Lucaya. When Groves approached the government about the land for residential and touristic development, it was right about the time that Fidel Castro was taking over in Cuba. And as such, the casino operators in Cuba needed someplace safe to go on the East Coast of the United States of America, because at the time there would have been no other opportunities for gaming on the East Coast. And the Grand Bahama Development Company, the Lucaya side of the equation, approached the government about getting a casino license to operate a casino in Freeport, in Lucaya. And the government saw this as a great opportunity and provided what was then the first commercial license for gaming in the country. And the tourism market and the tourism plant on Grand Bahama all grew around servicing this gaming opportunity. So you had casinos pop up, you had resorts that encompass these casinos pop up, and you had junket flights from the US on a daily basis. At one point in time, people used to leave their job in Florida, drive to the airport, fly to Freeport, gamble all night, fly back home, change their clothes, and go back to work. And the resorts that had these casinos, and outside the resorts as well, all had nightlife activities that catered to these gamers. And golf was a big attraction during the daytime, and gaming and nightlife, another nightlife during the nighttime. Interestingly, some of those hotels were inland on an island where you have miles and miles of beaches, but obviously gaming was the draw, not so much the outdoor environment at that time. Well, the invent of gaming in Florida was a huge negative for gaming on Grand Bahama Island, and therefore a huge hit to tourism on Grand Bahama Island. And I know that a lot of people kind of blame the hurricanes of the 2000s for the demise of tourism on Grand Bahama. But if you give it real thought, it really was the fact that we lost our niche. We no longer had anything special to offer to the traveling public that wasn't available elsewhere in the Caribbean, and elsewhere in Florida. And so we kind of started a slow death in the tourism market. The hurricanes of 2004, we had two that came along and did a lot of damage to the tourism plant. But that was really only the final nail in the coffin kind of thing. We have had multiple hurricanes since then, which have done even more damage, which has kind of exacerbated the regrowth and turnaround of the tourist industry. But fundamentally, up to now, we haven't done a lot to be innovative in the tourist market since the loss of gaming as the anchor for tourist attractions. We do now have the cruise lines taking a significant interest in tourism in Grand Bahama, with Carnival Cruise Line spending somewhere around $600 million on its own, if you wish, destination on the island, its own theme park, if you wish. And that is going to be a significant boost as they are now turning, essentially, it seems to me like all of their ships now are going to be stopping in Grand Bahama. We have 2 ships a day, 7 days a week at the moment, since they opened a couple of weeks ago. And they intend to complete another pier at their facility, which will allow them to increase to 4 ships a day, 7 days a week. So there should be a significant uptake in cruise passengers coming to Grand Bahama over the next couple of years. We do still, though, need to have attractions that bring stopover visitors to Grand Bahama. And we're in the throes of a potential project. And I say potential because while it's been announced, we haven't seen any tangible activity on the ground as yet for the redevelopment of the Grand Lucayan Resort, which includes the inclusion of the Lucaya Marketplace and the Lucaya Marina and Golf Course. So we're hoping that continues to develop. It again is supposed to be more of a water theme park with hotel and timeshare rooms available, and the marketplace and marina and golf course to support it. So we're hoping that comes to fruition. Royal Caribbean has acquired the former Xanadu Hotel, which was originally created by Mr. Ludwig, who also happened to be the person who dredged the original harbor at Hawksbill Creek, and also the developer of the 2,000-acre subdivision that we call Bahamia. He built in Bahamia this high-rise hotel called Xanadu on the canal. And Howard Hughes was known to have lived there the latter years of his life, somewhat as a recluse in the top floors of that resort hotel. That hotel has been derelict now for a number of years and was sold to the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line consortium, I believe, Celebrity Cruise Lines in particular. And they are planning to redevelop it as a water destination, a beach destination for their cruise passengers, similar to what Carnival has done with Celebration Key further out east. So if you look at the tourism industry at the moment, it is definitely presently being dominated by the cruise lines, each of them creating their own destinations on island. The one at the Grand Bahama is intended to be open to the public, so not just the cruise lines, but the other two are definitely private to the particular cruise investor. But it is kind of indicative of the fact that we on Grand Bahama have not stepped up and created attractions ourselves. So the cruise lines have done it for themselves. And of course, we will have benefits from that in the Grand Bahama economy, but probably not as great as if we had actually Grand Bahama investors that actually stepped up and done these kinds of investments to entice the cruise lines to bring more passengers to Grand Bahama. Last on the tourism front, we did have a reasonably world-class airport with U.S. pre-clearance of customs and immigration, and that was under 10 foot of water in Hurricane Dorian, and so it is currently in need of, some say demolition, some say that it could be resuscitated, but we definitely need to have a new international airport built, whether in the current footprint in the current building or not. Currently, we're working both international and domestic flights out of the domestic terminal, which is obviously not designed for that purpose. And it is not the best of situations, but it is functional. You know, we in Grand Bahama compare it to New Providence, and we say, you know, we need an airport like New Providence, but the reality of it is the rest of the Bahamas has airports that are smaller than the one that we still have functional in Grand Bahama, and they're doing quite well with their airports. So we do, as we grow, airline passengers will need more capacity in the airport, but I don't think that is necessary until we actually have the demand for passengers. Now, that might, if the Grand Bahama goes ahead as planned, they need to be on the same track in terms of development. So if we skip back to the Freeport side of, maybe just before I leave the resort development side, besides tourism, the Grand Bahama Development Company platted and sold a lot of property in the baby boomer market in the U.S., ostensibly to be the retirement home for baby boomers as they exited the work environment and wanted to settle down into an offshore, nearby offshore destination, catering specifically to their needs. While that was the plan, and Grand Bahama Development Company was well on its way to selling individual lots, the 67, 68-ish bend or break speech also was a negative in that regard. And landowners and developers all essentially put those projects on the back burner where they've been ever since. So the Grand Bahama Development Company has continued to develop and sell lots mostly into the domestic market, some of the higher end lots into the international market around canals, because Grand Bahama, Freeport, Grand Bahama has an extensive array of saltwater canals that open to the ocean, and being only 50 odd, 60 miles away from West Palm Beach is easy for boating access into Grand Bahama. So the not only has the tourist market kind of I don't want to say evaporated, but decreased significantly, and shifted from overnight tourists to cruise line tourists, but the residential resort development never developed the way it was intended. Uh, so there's still lots of land available in Lucaya for development and repurposing, if we can figure out and provide the necessary investors to move it forward in a cohesive and collaborative way. So now I could switch back to Freeport side. So the original reason for the development of what we call the port area was that it was built around a deep water harbor or a port. And I know that the name Grand Bahama Port Authority is kind of a misnomer of sorts, because the port is only a small component of the development of Freeport Lucaya. It's a sizable port, but in the scheme of the 230 square miles, is only a couple of thousand acres. But the intent was to grow industry around the port that would utilize the resources of Grand Bahama. And the first person out of the block was a company called Bahama Cement. And their business was mining the very clean and pristine limestone on Grand Bahama Island to make Portland cement. They were followed by a pharmaceutical chemical company called Syntex Pharmaceuticals, which was based in Palo Alto, California, but founded in Mexico. Interestingly, both these companies were founded originally in Mexico. And of course, they were in Freeport mainly because of the free trade zone concessions. They were in a high profit margin business, and being in a jurisdiction that had zero income tax, and also provided for zero tariffs on the goods that they imported and exported for the purposes of their business, meant that it was very beneficial for them to operate out of a jurisdiction like the port area of Freeport. They were then followed by what it was called the Bahamas Oil Refining Company, which was owned by Chevron initially, and they built a mega crude refining facility and storage facility here on Grand Bahama because of its location. Again, one of the attributes of Grand Bahama is its location, being within the shipping lanes and having near shore deep water. So it was a good opportunity for them, and they built a crude refinery that operated from the early 60s to the late 70s as a crude refiner, and then shifted its business model into being a offshore bunkering, if you wish, service for storage and shipment of oil around the world. It is currently changed. It has changed ownership a couple of times, and it's currently owned by Buckeye Hub, which I believe is based in Louisiana, I think. I don't remember right off the top of my head. But it's currently now not doing any refining, but is a significant player in the bunkering of crude oil for crude owners around the world. So the island kind of started to drift into a pharmaceutical chemical production kind of arena. with then a company called Gis Bacardi's building a pharmaceutical plant next door to the Syntex site. And they were a Dutch company, and they manufactured their suite of chemical products for the pharma industry. Eventually, changes in market resulted in them leaving the island and selling the facility to the Uniroyal Company, who were in the business of making additives, chemical additives for the rubber industry. So of course, the Uniroyal makes and sells tires, and they use the facility to make the necessary additives for preserving and protecting the rubber that they use in tires. And that went on for a number of years. But it's a challenge for low profit margin companies in the manufacturing sector to succeed on a small island. A, because of logistics. You have to import and export everything. You can't just send a rail car down the street to pick up another, 5,000 gallons of XYZ. You got to ship it in. B, the cost of utilities is significantly higher than you would have on a continent where there's a large number, where there's economies of scale. And there's also a significantly reasonably high labor cost for doing business in the islands. We're very pro-labor as a government administration. We have lots of labor laws and we have unions. So we get a double whammy in that regard. But we do have a reasonably well-educated workforce, with a lot of the professionals having been educated outside the country up until the time that the government formed the University of Bahamas a couple of years ago. And now you have a mix of professionals who are educated in country, and still a significant number who are educated outside of the country, and who have stayed outside of the country because they felt that there hasn't been enough development in country to occupy them and challenge them and reward them appropriately. So there's lots of Bahamians around the world who would be on the radar screen to employ should we increase the investment pool here on Grand Bahama Island. There's no shortage of them there, and some of them are in very high positions in the countries where they live. But industry kind of then morphed into more of a mining operation as the pharma companies battled with changing product markets. Syntex patents on its products expired. It then sold the facility a couple of times to, again, generic manufacturers who struggled with costs. They then sold to a company called Pharmachem Technologies, who made the active ingredients for the world's greatest HIV drug for Gilead Sciences. And that underwent a good run of, I don't know, 20 odd years working for Gilead, until they then switched their product line, and Pharmachem then had to build new facilities to be able to support that new line. That project didn't pan out as well as it could have, should have, would have, and Gilead eventually pulled out because Pharmachem didn't complete and get into production on time to meet Gilead's needs. But we're go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that's a very, very comprehensive history of Grand Bahama. I want to, I guess, focus in to give our listeners perhaps more kind of visualization of the island and of some kind of key elements in the narrative. I mean, what always stood out to me, you mentioned this, but just to reiterate, is right, the original Hawksbill Creek Agreement is from 1955. And so if you look at the standard history of special economic zones in the modern world, they usually start with Shannon, Ireland, which I think was 1959, maybe
No,
1958.
1955, Freeport, and 55 was the first.
Yeah, Freeport was the first, but it's kind of forgotten in some of these more mainstream histories. The arrangement's also a little bit unique, right? The Hawksbill Creek Agreement is a contract between the Grand Bahama Port Authority and the government, while most special economic zones are created by legislation. And
No,
it's
actually, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement is both a contract and an act. The Hawksbill Creek Agreement is codified in statute law. It actually is the only law in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas that has a clause in it that prevents Parliament from making any changes to the act without the consent of four-fifths of the licensees of the Grand Bahama Port Authority. And that was done obviously to give comfort to Groves and his group at the time that the government wasn't just going to willy-nilly change things as they plunk down their hard-earned cash to develop the city. So it is definitely codified in law, and that's part of the challenge that we've had over the years, and challenges between the Port Authority and the government over adherence and compliance to the law.
Yeah, and then the 60s, I've always kind of visualized it a little bit as a East Coast Vegas, where Grand Bahama had the casino, right? They had famous musicians coming down to perform.
Right.
They had all of this kind of like high life, glamorous city. And then, as you mentioned, the bend or break speech in the late 60s, the majority rule led to tension between the Grand Bahama Port Authority and the government, which ultimately kind of caused some investors and some business owners in Freeport to become a little bit nervous about changes and lead to Grand Bahama. Freeport still grew after that, but kind of the rate of growth was a lot slower than it had been in the 60s, and perhaps slower than it otherwise would have been if the investors and business owners weren't wary of their relationship with government.
I agree. Totally agree. There was definitely a change in trajectory after the Band Break speech.
And then right now, what you're left with today, as you mentioned, right, there were the infrastructure on the island is built for an estimated 250,000, or the infrastructure in Freeport is built for an estimated 250,000 people, while only 40,000 people currently live in Freeport, 50,000 people on the whole island. I guess just for some additional visualization, the island itself is almost twice the size of Singapore. I think it's 1.8 times the size of Singapore, and 160,000 acres in the port area is 10 times the size, over 10 times the size of Manhattan. Manhattan's about 15,000 acres. So we're just talking about like a staggering amount of land, a very large area with relatively high quality infrastructure. But you drive through downtown, there's kind of abandoned buildings. You mentioned many of the hotels that have been abandoned. So you're left with this like great proximity to the US, less than a 30-minute flight, a very high quality port, an airport that could be improved, a tremendous amount of undeveloped land, fairly high quality infrastructure, and just going through kind of the question that keeps like bugging in the back of my mind is, right, like, why isn't more investment happening here? Why isn't more economic activity happening here? If you look, for example, at like beachfront property in Miami or even far north of Miami, it's selling for probably an order of magnitude higher than beachfront property in Freeport, despite not being that different, and the Freeport property arguably being a little bit more beautiful.
Yeah, so it to me it's kind of a chicken and egg thing again. You know, I've been I worked for DevCo and the Port Authority for 10 years, and so I've seen it from the inside and the outside. Yeah.
Yeah, can you explain what DevCo is, just for our listeners who might not be familiar?
Sure. So the Grand originally the Grand Bahama Port Authority was the umbrella entity that Groves formed and signed the Hawksbill Creek Agreement with the government with, and it had subsidiaries under it, which were all of the municipal providers, and land, and it was the land developer on the Freeport side of the city. When Groves went back to the government for the 110,000 acre tranche of land, he took on some partners at the time, and they formed an entity called the Grand Bahama Development Company, and that 110,000 acres was vested in the Grand Bahama Development Company. So the Grand Bahama Development Company is the master developer of Lucaya, and the Grand Bahama Port Authority was the master developer and regulator of Freeport, with the Port Authority also having regulatory responsibility for Lucaya as well. So the Grand Bahama Port Authority was both a developer and a regulator, whereas DEFCO was just a developer, just a developer of 110,000 acres of real estate. After the Bender break speech, all of the Port Authority's assets were moved into the Grand Bahama Development Company, and that company was the company that essentially went public by way of the Panamanian entity. And the Grand Bahama Port Authority then remained assetless, but the sole custodian of the agreement with the government of the Bahamas, and therefore the sole regulator in Freeport, Lucaya. Fast forward to the introduction of Hutchison Whampoa in the early 90s, when the two families decided they wanted to sell land to Hutchison Whampoa as part of the deal for Hutchison Whampoa to bring its container transshipment terminal to Freeport Harbor. They thought it convenient to sell 50% of the Grand Bahama Development Company to Hutchison, but they didn't want to sell all the underlying subsidiaries. So they created another company called Port Group Limited, and they moved all the subsidiaries into Port Group Limited, and the Grand Bahama Development Company reverted back to just being the master developer of the 110,000 acres of land that we call Lucaya. So Port Group Limited is essentially the sister company to Grand Bahama Port Authority. It holds all of the operating assets and all of the land assets, and the Grand Bahama Port Authority is the quasi-local government regulator of the city of Freeport, Lucaya.
Yeah, and you worked for DevCo for about a decade, so tell us, like, what did it look like from the belly of the beast?
Yeah, so I worked first and foremost in Port Authority Limited, the regulatory function, as the person responsible for regulating the built environment. So building department, environmental, providing the land surveying and registration. All that stuff fell under me in the GBPA group. And by virtue of that, I obviously had to interface with lots of potential investors who came to Grand Bahama, to Freeport, looking to invest. I subsequently moved from the Port Authority side of the equation over to the Grand Bahama development side of the equation and spent the remainder of my decade there. So I kind of split it approximately 50-50, where I was vice president of development for the Grand Bahama Development Company. And so I was definitely very integrally involved in the solicitation of investors and the review of their investment desires, providing the land locating land for their developments, and helping the whole process of moving them through the activities of getting licensed, permitted, and the like. And I think one of the things that you could always say about investors is nobody ever wants to be first. Everybody wants to be early, but nobody wants to be first. And after the initial demise of the resort development and then the demise of the tourism development, and the challenges with the industrial development because of the cost structure of doing business on a small island, there was a definite decline, and everybody then got cold feet. Not only those who left, but anybody who was interested in coming, kind of all felt, well, we see this opportunity, but something is not quite right, and we're going to wait to see who's going to jump in first. And so it's always been a challenge to get somebody to jump in. I'm delighted that the Carnival jumped in, because people will now begin to see there will be like-minded people who will follow Carnival. Concord Wilshire is obviously an example of that. Like-minded people who now want to invest, and if they could get off the ground and go in, there'd be even more people who see the opportunity and want to get in while the opportunity is ripe. But there's been challenges not only with the markets, but also challenges with a love-hate relationship between the government and the Port Authority. That has gone on now since the bend or break speech. They've been pecking away at each other for decades. And really and truly, the way I see it is the Port Authority is a franchisee of the government of the Bahamas, and they should have a franchisor-franchisee relationship, but they actually, from time to time, have a very adversarial relationship, and that hasn't boded well for investment either, because in the more recent years, the government has infringed on the one-stop shop regulatory regime that the Port Authority was granted in 1955. And so investors come to Grand Bahama, to Freeport, talk to the Port Authority, get their minds wrapped around this whole concept of a free trade zone, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, a one-stop shop. And then they go in to have a conversation with the government, and the government says, well, it doesn't quite happen that way. And so then there's this question about, do I have two governments to deal with, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to streamline this whole process back again to something that does not give up the sovereign right of the country, but also honors the essence of a free trade zone, and therefore help it to regain its international status as an international trading hub and touristic destination, or whatever it is that we're going to turn it into over the next decade or so.
Yeah, I think that's, and then also you mentioned this, let's call it friction between the Port Authority and the government. I mean, that friction seems to be quite hot right now. The government is claiming $350 million in unpaid tax liability, and the Port Authority and the government are currently in arbitration to decide what the outcome of that is. There is a clause in the Hawksbill Creek Agreement that says that basically any government expenditure over what the government tax revenue is from the zone needs to be reimbursed by the Port Authority. And the government is claiming basically over the last 5 years, that number is around $350 million.
So the devil is always in the details, Mark. The government is saying any government expenditures, any public expenditures is the way they're kind of coaching that. The Act doesn't actually say that. The Act says any expenditures for government services. And that may sound like semantics, but there's a huge difference between government services and government expenditures. The flip side of the coin is on the revenue side for the government, the Act says any revenue from tariffs and excise taxes. Well, the government of the Bahamas itself, during its quest to join WTO, started migrating from tariffs and excise taxes to consumer taxes like VAT. So it has, by its own actions, reduced its tariff revenue while still increasing its revenue. And I'm understanding, I haven't seen the claim, but I'm understanding that they're not counting all this additional revenue on the revenue side of the equation. So again, this is another situation where the legal fraternity, the courts, arbiters, whatever, are going to decide the fate of a disagreement between the Port Authority and the government of the Bahamas. There have been a number of them in the past. We've had a Royal Commission of Inquiry on the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. We've had a number of court cases on the specific aspects of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, and there is one commonality between them all. The Hawksbill Creek Agreement has always won. So we currently have a situation where we have this arbitration matter over whether or not there is a shortfall that the government has experienced over the last couple of years. But just to add to that, the government of the tariffs that they're claiming, there's also the appreciation that has to be made that the government waived tariffs for Grand Bahama and Abaco after Dorian. So if you're only counting tariffs, I could understand how you could come up with a $357 million deficit. But that's not for me to decide. That's for those with a lot more stripes on their shoulder to decide than I can. But my point is simply that it is not as clear cut a matter as it seems. And for me, when asked about it, my answer is I would much prefer to see the government and the Port Authority come to an arrangement, whether that is one of modifying the act to more accurately reflect current circumstances with taxation in the country, or something. But we need to have clarity going forward as to exactly what is going to be included on each side of the ledger. The Port Authority has no way to control what the government chooses to spend in Grand Bahama beyond what is truly government services. So it is kind of behind the eight ball and swimming with its hands tied behind its back in that regard. So out of this whole mess, and I call it a mess, we need to have clarity going forward for the next 30 years. How are we going to account for government revenue and government expenses in accordance with the intent of the act? Because obviously the letter of the act has now been superseded by other activities that have gone on in the country over the last couple of decades. But there's also the issue of the Utilities Commission, ERCA. The ERCA is now claiming that its act makes it the sole regulator of utilities in the country, including the port area. Well, you can't usurp the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. The agreement has clauses that prevent you from usurping it. So this is another one of these situations that have ended up in court or ended up in the courts, and will have to be addressed. And lots of lawyers are going to make money again, as always the case with all of these cases. And at the end of the day, there is nothing that suggests that the government can ever win any of these cases against what has been an extremely well-written act. I mean, all the protections in the act are basically ironclad.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, I have been, my understanding, or at least my read, is that the government is initiated the arbitration in part because of a displeasure with the two families that currently control the Port Authority and related companies. And I don't know the details of the lawsuit beyond what is publicly reported. And then two, as you mentioned, right, a lot of the act is 70 years old, and some things have materially changed since then that make it a little bit hard to interpret exactly, right, like what the right path forward is. I agree with you. I think the key to really unlocking the true potential of Grand Bahama is figuring out how the Port Authority can reestablish a working relationship with the government, where the government doesn't see it as a foreign enclave in their country, but rather sees it as a extension of Bahamian sovereignty and Bahamian will, while at the same time ensuring that there is a competitive enough business environment to attract investment, to create jobs, to really build a thriving city.
So that's my franchise or franchisee analogy. I think that in business, franchisors work very collaboratively with their franchisees to ensure the success of the franchisee that then ensures the success of the franchisor. And we need to get to that point with the port area, with the GBPA and government. What it's going to take to make that happen. I we have everybody has their opinion on what should be done. I have been a strong advocate over the last 2 decades, decade and a half, sorry, no, 2 decades, even when I was in the Port Authority, for separating not just the Grand Bahama Port Authority and Port Group Limited legally, but separating them ownership-wise to make the Port Authority Limited a public trust, essentially. And my rationale for that is, as long as Port Group Limited is not going to act as a developer, there is no legitimate reason for it to have regulatory responsibility over everybody else. If Port Group Limited was acting as a developer, or if some other investor came in and was acting as a developer, as was the original Port Authority, then I would have no compunction whatsoever about those two entities staying tied at the base. Because you could then see the value to a master developer having the ability to control the development that goes on within his master development. But for the last number of decades, the Port Authority Port Group and its subsidiaries have essentially been caretakers of the port area. They have invested in very little, if anything. They have ostensibly done some promotions, trying to seek investors, but there's been no substantive investment. They did put some capital in with Hutchison in the original container port, which they then spun back out as soon as it was up and running and making a profit. They put some equity in the Grand Bahama shipyard, which they have now, I'm understanding, either fully or almost fully divested themselves of, as kind of seed money to help encourage the main investors to engage in the investment. But they have not been a developer. When I was there, we were not a developer. We had the biggest argument between the two shareholders of DevCo, Hutchison and Port Group, as to whether or not we were going to involve ourselves and put skin in the game on two development projects that were being earmarked for Freeport, Lucaya at the time. Hutchison didn't want to, Port Group did want to, and at the end of the day, we ended up losing both projects to the infamous shareholder battle between the St. George's and the Haywoods. But the bottom line is there was no appetite for putting up the capital to be an investor, to be a developer. And so for me, if that is going to be the status quo, then we should separate the regulatory regime and make it transparent from the land holding and the municipal provider holdings of Port Group Limited.
Sure. So, I mean, I've always thought the kind of best path forward is to figure out how to develop Grand Bahama, because it's very close to Florida. It's kind of the best place I've seen to build or massively expand on a city in my career, and I've seen a lot of opportunities. And I think what that takes is investors who can partner with the Port Authority and current shareholders and have a vision for development, combined with the government that shares that vision and can modernize the Hawksbill Creek Agreement to clarify roles and responsibilities in terms of payments, as well as in terms of streamlining red tape to make sure investors have an easy time developing property and businesses. And I think that would benefit all the parties, right? It would benefit people on Grand Bahama because there would be more jobs, benefit Bahamians because there would be more jobs if they want to relocate to Grand Bahama, would benefit the current shareholders because their asset would end up being worth a lot more money, even if their shares would be less because of new investment, and would benefit the government because the second most populous Bahamian city would be attracting a lot of investment and job creation, not to mention the tax revenue that would come in from it.
So yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with the benefits that you're articulating. I think that the Freeport Lucaya has been like a 747 loaded up with passengers sitting on the tarmac waiting for clearance to take off now for a number of decades. It's kind of unconscionable that we've allowed it to sit here and stew in its own mess for the last couple of decades. Part of that is the current owners of the assets, and part of it is the government. And we need to find a marriage made in heaven. I think that there are a couple of different directions this could take. I don't believe that the government is ever going to want to revamp the Hawksbill Creek Agreement as long as Port Group Limited is not in a position to be a developer. That I just don't see that happening. I see an opportunity for a new developer to come in and take out Port Group Limited and negotiate with the government to revamp the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. That's one option. Another option, as you and I have talked in the past, is to split the GBPA Limited out into some trust of some sort to the benefit of the citizens of the Bahamas, with a board and management group that represents all of the stakeholders, including Port Group Limited, but also including government, local government, licensees, and others. Therefore, making it a true quasi-local government entity, standalone from the control of Port Group Limited. At that point in time, I could see the government of the Bahamas wanting to discuss a revamp of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. But as long as there is this disdain, whether it is valid or not, there is a disdain with the government and a lot of citizens about the current shareholding and activity of Port Group Limited. And we have to get around that one way or the other, with one or the other of the options that I just articulated. I believe that there are people out there who are interested in both options, but we need to come to a position where we have an agreed upon solution that both the families and the government, and to some extent Hutchison, can wrap their minds around and agree to, and move forward as a franchise or franchisee kind of collaboration. And if we could do that, and I believe that we can, if we have the will to do it, that we can do it. It technically is possible to do. The solutions aren't rocket science. It's just the political will to do it. And if we could do it, then Grand Bahama takes off again like it did when it was coined the Magic City. I mean, the 60s and early 70s was meteoric. And then post-bend or break, it started to plateau, and then hurricanes and gaming in Florida put it on a downward track. So it was built that way in the first place. It could be built that way again. The land hasn't gone away. The location hasn't gone away. Technically, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement hasn't gone away, although some of its provisions have and need to be reestablished. But the fundamentals that made it such a great opportunity 70 years ago still exist. They just need to be harnessed.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to end the podcast. Thanks so much for your time. It's a good closing remark.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Charter City podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd appreciate you sharing it on social media. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again.